We're going to continue our Romans series this morning. We're going to continue it with a message entitled The Law and the Lostness of Humanity, looking at Romans chapter 1:18 through verse 3:20. One of the challenging parts of this section of Romans is if you read it in isolation of the rest of the book of Romans, it's a rather horrifyingly negative passage. So, bear with me this morning as I try to put a little bit of a positive spin on what Paul had to say here this morning. Thank you, Tony. The other thing I'll ask you to bear with me is simply this. For my entire life, and I'm 67 years old, I've done my speaking using paper notes. I've decided this morning to try and join the 21st century, and I'm going to attempt to use my pad. So if I fumble around a little bit, please be understanding. We old people are technologically challenged. Last week, Tony shared with us a little of the background of the book of Romans. It's really, really important to understand the book of Romans, what the background was. So I'm going to add just a few things here that Tony didn't cover last week. One of the aspects of the Roman Empire that we sometimes forget about is that Rome had a rather miraculously rapid growth. In the 200 years leading up to the birth of Jesus, Rome exploded from being a little local republic in the Italian peninsula to being a worldwide empire that controlled Western Europe and the whole of the Mediterranean world. It had just grown incredibly, all the more amazing in an era in which people walked or rode horses, took sailing ships, really had no rapid means of transportation. The Roman armies literally walked around the world to conquer the world. It was just kind of an amazing thing. And one of the outcomes that was as Rome conquered other countries, Rome became very wealthy. Wealth poured into the empire. The downside of that, though, was that the Roman economy became a slave economy. Roman employers pretty quickly discovered that it's a lot cheaper to buy a slave than it is to pay a worker to do the job. This had a devastating effect on the poor class in Rome. The working class suddenly found jobs drying up. Why pay you to do a job when I can just buy this guy? I'll own him forever and he'll work for free. Family farms went away. Farmers were just absolutely devastated because Roman agriculture became dominated by huge estates worked by slaves. And all of these suddenly poor and unemployed people came to the cities looking for a better way of life, looking for work. So you had masses of unemployed and unemployable people coming into Rome. While Rome was a very wealthy city, that wealth was concentrated in the hands of just a small number of people. The vast majority of Roman citizens lived lives of poverty and desperation. They were crowded together into tenement buildings. They were underemployed. They had almost no food, almost no money, very little hope. Now, if that sounds like a bad situation, it really was. This created a tinderbox in Rome. And while the Roman emperor and the Roman rulers were very, very powerful, they also lived in absolute fear and dread of the massive mobs in Rome. Having these people get angry was not a good thing. Romans had a bad habit of rioting. Things could just get very, very ugly. So one of the things that you run into in Rome was that the Roman emperor and the rulers had very, very little tolerance for dissent and protest, as those things had a habit of exploding into riots, and they were just terrified of the masses of people. One of their solutions to this was bread and circuses. The Roman emperors would attempt to buy the loyalty of the masses by giving them free food and free entertainment. Roman poet Juvenal put it this way: give them bread and circuses and they will never revolt. And that was kind of the attitude the Roman emperors had. They weren't so much taking care of people because they cared about them. They were taking care of people to keep them from revolting and throwing them out of power. So bear in mind, that Roman aversion to disturbance, to civil disturbance, in reading the book of Romans. Tony mentioned last week that the Jews under Claudius were expelled from Rome. That happened several times, actually. This wasn't the first expulsion of the Jews from Rome. We read about that exclusion in the book of Acts chapter 18. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So, a matter of historical fact, Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. We get a little bit more detail, though, from a Roman historian named Suetonius, who wrote, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Crassus, he expelled them from Rome." So it seems that the reason the Jews were thrown out of Rome under Claudius was because Christianity had become an impact in the Jewish community. And this was creating tensions within the Jewish community. And very typically of Roman poor, they were reacting by civil commotion, riots. And Claudius wasn't going to put up with this, so he simply tossed the Jews out of Rome. Now, Paul knew the history of the unrest. What Paul didn't know was what came next. You see, the Jewish people in the Roman Empire had a well-deserved reputation of being hard to govern. Following the close of the book of Acts, the Jews revolted not once but 3 times. They rebelled first in 66 to 73. The first Jewish-Roman war, they rose up, and this war did not end well for the Jews. It ended with Jerusalem being ripped down, stone by stone, to the ground, the temple destroyed, the citizens of Jerusalem scattered. But that was followed by another revolt at the beginning of the second century. This one was a little bit more widespread throughout the empire, but not quite as intense, not nearly as well known. This one didn't end well for the Jewish people either. And then the third revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Israel rose up to once and for all throw Rome out. You have to understand the history of the Jewish people. This was the people who had lived under the occupation of the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Greeks. And they had gained their freedom for just a few short years before the Romans marched in and took over. So this was a people primed to want their freedom. And they rose up again, and it didn't end at all well for Israel. At the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Israel was utterly destroyed. Many Jews sold into slavery, others scattered throughout the world. Israel ceased to exist as a nation until the 20th century, utterly destroyed. Now, Paul didn't know about those revolts to come. I don't think they'd have surprised him, but he was all too well acquainted with the history of the Jewish people in Rome. And I think he was concerned with what was going on with Rome in light of that. The Jews had been allowed to return after Claudius died. And as they came back into Rome and entered back into the church, they met the Gentile believers. And there started to be a clash between the two. You know, the Judaizers were always a problem in the early church. Jewish Christians who had grown up with a tradition of following the law, long lists of rules. This is how you showed your devotion to God. And they expected the Gentile Christians to follow the same rules. And this created a lot of tension between the two. Paul's answer, I think, to this, knowing that the division within the church was an explosive situation, not only is the division within the church bad for the church itself, as we spend our times fighting with each other instead of reaching the world, but it's kind of a division within the Roman church was setting them up for Rome to give them some attention of a kind they didn't want. And Paul's answer was to take these two very different groups of believers and try and bring them together on the common basis that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And that really, I think, is what Paul is leading to, what Paul is driving at in these 2 chapters of Romans. He first addresses the Gentile believers. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of the people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and His divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. That God has revealed Himself to all mankind through His creation. The church has always understood it to mean exactly that. Augustine, great father of the church, early theologian, still influential today, writing at the end of the 4th and early 5th century, beginning of the 5th century, wrote these words: I suggested to you that the learned people among the nations, the most outstanding of whom are called philosophers, examine nature itself, and through the things that have been made, recognize their Maker. They did not hear the prophets, nor did they receive the law of God, yet God spoke to them silently through the very operation of the world. The spectacle of the world drew them to inquire about the one who had produced all things. They could not accept the notion that heaven and earth had somehow been established without a maker. So the church has always known that the world shouts that God is here. Creation screams that there's a creator behind it all. And this wasn't a unique idea for Paul. We find David writing in the 19th Psalm, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands." Every culture the world has ever seen has had a concept that there's something beyond the material world, that God is out there. If you travel the world, you'll find holy sites and temples everywhere. God has revealed enough in creation for us to know He's there. Now, men being men have done their best to explain this away. Before the 20th century, science pretty much believed that the stars that we see is the entire universe. One galaxy, one collection of stars. And they believed that this was an eternal and unchanging universe. The stars were born, they lived their lives, they died, new stars were born, that this was a universe running on this clockwork mechanism. And that was the consensus of science for a long time. But there was a problem. As you see, as telescopes got better and better, they began to realize there were these little blurs of light out there in the sky that they couldn't explain. And they assumed at first that these were simply gas clouds. But in 1924, an astronomer named Edward Hubble discovered that these were different galaxies. Telescopes had advanced to the point he could see stars in them. And as science studied these new galaxies, they found more and more of them. As they found more and more of them, they realized something startling, that these galaxies were rushing away from each other. And as they tracked it backwards in time, they began to realize that at some point our entire universe had started in a single point. And at a definite point in time, had simply burst into being. Our universe was not an eternal clockwork machine. It had a beginning, and it had exploded into being out of nothing. This was quite a shock to scientists. I'm not sure quite why. Moses told us as much more than 3,000 years ago when he wrote, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." Science now has a question it can't answer. Where did it all come from? Why are we here? The galaxy's not eternal. It burst into being. What happened here? Now, Paul in this section expounds on this at great length. He talks about how the Gentiles knew that there was a God out there. They knew they should be seeking God. But instead, they very contrarily started going after gods of their own creation. They made up gods who were glorified human beings, very much like them, not perfect, usually didn't demand very much of them. Paul wrote, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened." And I'm not going to go through it line by line. If you read that chapter, Paul goes through in great detail explaining how the Gentiles had fallen into sin of every variety because they didn't know the true God. They didn't seek after the true God. Paul continues also that we have another proof that God's there. If it wasn't enough proof that the universe exists, God has revealed himself in our consciences. Paul wrote, "They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times defending them." We've been given an innate sense of right and wrong. As I look at the cultures of the world, one thing that has always struck me is just how similar those senses are from culture to culture to culture. Now, some really primitive warrior cultures, kind of put some restrictions on that. It's wrong to murder somebody in my clan. Those outsiders, that's okay. But they still have a basic sense of morality, that we don't murder the people around us. We don't steal from other people. Men do not swipe other men's wives. This is common from every culture in the world. And if you don't believe that God has written his law upon the human heart, consider this. How many of you here are parents or have ever dealt with a small child? Most of you. Then you've probably heard these words. It's not fair. Some years ago, Shirley and I had one of our nieces living with us for a few years when she was a small child. It was absolutely amazing to me that age 3 or 4, she came up with this. It's not fair. We have something within us that gives us an innate sense that there should be fairness, there should be rule, there should be order in the universe. The law is written on our hearts so that we know what's good, and evil points us to a lawgiver. Now, there was a problem in Greek philosophy that Paul addressed here. This was common in the early church. And Paul wrote these words, "Someone might argue, if my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? Why not say, as some slanderously claim that we say, let us do evil that good might result. Their condemnation is just." So this was an ongoing problem within the church. You had on the one hand the Jewish believers who were law-bound, and you had on the other hand Gentile believers who looked at it and said, well, grace, I'm forgiven. Whoopee! I can do anything I want. And there were some Greek philosophers who even said, what you do in life matters so very little. Go out and sin more. Be horrible. The more God forgives you, the more it glorifies God. So this is kind of about, wait a minute, from Paul, don't take this too far. Paul then turns his attention to Jews or Christians. And he asks the question, what advantage then is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? Much in every way. First of all, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. You see, the Jewish people had the advantage that God had spoken to them through the prophets. They didn't have simply general revelation to know that somewhere out there, there's a God and I should be looking for him. God had said, here I am, and this is what I'm like. But there was a problem. When we speak of Jewish law, we usually think Old Testament. And that's true. But the Jews were human. And as soon as rabbinical scholars got a hold of the Jewish law, they started writing volumes on how to obey the Word of God in detail. They stacked rule upon rule until the meaning of the law almost got lost. And they eventually made following the rules the focus, even when the reason for the rules got lost. He repeated this 3 times. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. This was important enough for Moses to repeat 3 times. But why? Most biblical scholars look at this and they believe that what Moses was saying here was do not follow the Canaanite religious practice of boiling a goat in its mother's milk as a fertility ritual. This is an act of idol worship. Don't do this. Don't worship idols. Seems simple enough. Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. But the rabbis took a hold of that very simple rule, and they reasoned, well, when you buy food in a market, you can't possibly know whether the meat you're buying and the milk you're buying came from the same mother goat. So it's best not to mix the meat with the milk. And that would have been fine if they had limited it to goats, which is what Moses was talking about. But they didn't. They expanded the rule to mean any meat with any dairy product. Don't eat beef cooked in goat's milk. Had nothing to do with the Canaanite ritual. Don't have a cheeseburger. Had nothing to do with the Canaanite ritual. And this became so embedded in Jewish culture that we even see it today. If you visit an Orthodox Jewish home, you'll find that Orthodox Jews maintain separate sets of dishes and utensils, depending on the particular traditions within their group and the financial state of the Jewish family. They may have in their kitchen 2 dishwashers, 2 ovens, maybe even 2 stoves, 2 sets of cabinets for storing the utensils, 2 refrigerators, 1 for meat and 1 for dairy. And these are the lists of rules that they follow, all to avoid the simple instruction of don't emulate this Canaanite pagan ritual. But the rules became more important than the meaning behind them. Paul stressed at great length in Romans that even with the law, the Jews were just as lost as the Gentiles. And he kind of concludes with this thought. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. All who sin under the law will be judged by the law. Paul was stressing to these Roman Christians, look, your traditions are different, your cultures are different, but guess what, folks? We're all in the same boat. We're all sinners. We're all lost. We all need Jesus. So quit fighting about it. Well, the big problem with the Judaizers was that they demanded that Gentile Christians follow Jewish law. And that put a huge roadblock in the path of the Gentiles. Just ask yourself for a moment, if we accepted Jewish law, including all of the additions from the rabbis in detail, as binding on Christians, how are you going to explain to your friends and neighbors it's okay to eat a tuna fish, but not a catfish? God will get you if you eat the catfish. It's okay to eat a salmon, but stay away from lobster. And my favorite, the bacon cheeseburger. Explain to me how it honors God to stay away from eating a beef patty with a piece of cheese slathered in bacon. I'm not making fun of Jewish law and Jewish tradition here. Most of them followed this very religiously. But the problem is when the rules take the place of the meaning behind the rules become meaningless. So a lot of Jewish custom and rules seem pretty bizarre to the Gentiles, the dietary rules and some of the others. And then there was the big problem, circumcision. To the Jews, this was a sign of their covenant with God. to the Greeks, to the Romans, to other Gentiles, this was a hideous mutilation of the human body. It was a major point of contention in the early church. Now, it would be nice if we could say in this day and age we're beyond these things, but you can go into a lot of churches today, and you'll find there are a lot of unwritten rules of things that we don't do, things that we do that have nothing to do with what Jesus taught. They're the cultural things that we slap on top of the gospel. When I was in high school, I got to know the two children of the pastor of a very conservative holiness church. And they were nice kids, but they didn't really fit into our culture. Now, the boy was a couple years younger than I am. He was a nice enough kid. Other than dressing a little drably, living kind of a boring life, he really didn't look or act that much different than the rest of us. The daughter, on the other hand, she really stuck out. This was a church in which women didn't cut their hair. Ladies, imagine for a moment having your hair down to your knees. And I mean that quite literally. That's how long the girl's hair was. She dressed in what her church defined as a modest manner. Would have fit in very fashionably in the 1930s, not so much in the 1970s. But you know, she was one of the nicest girls I've ever known. She was bright. She was a very nice person. Underneath the kind of odd appearance, she was very pretty. And I admit 16-year-old me, for a while, had a bit of a crush on the girl. But I knew that we lived in different worlds. I wasn't then a Christian, and I didn't understand her version of Christianity, of what having hair down to your knees and wearing weird clothes had anything to do with Jesus. So it was a real stumbling block to me. She couldn't go to dances or movies or sporting events or the theater or much of anything else. But as we talked one day, she invited me to her church. They were having a revival. And I politely declined. So there was something about this lifestyle that just seemed too strange to me. And it wasn't for another couple of years that I eventually became a Christian. Now, one thing to note carefully in this section, Paul never tells the Jews, don't follow your customs. Don't follow your laws. He never tells the Gentiles that they have to adopt them either. He doesn't demand that the two groups become the same, just that they get along. And Paul doesn't really talk here about how the groups must relate to each other. That comes later in the book of Romans. I'll be back in November to talk about that. So what can we learn from this section of the book of Romans? There are, I think, a couple of practical lessons that we can learn here about evangelism, about how we talk about Jesus to other people. Jonathan Edwards was a great preacher, a great theologian in America. His writings are still read today. He had brilliant things to say. Jonathan Edwards was one of the leaders of the First Great Awakening, a huge revival that spread across the American colonies in the 1700s. Many, many people were saved. Jonathan Edwards today is probably most famous for a sermon that he preached entitled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And in this sermon, Jonathan Edwards presented very graphic pictures of sinners being dangled by a thread over the fiery pit. It was all fire and brimstone preaching. Kind of odd to our ears today. But in the time in which Jonathan Edwards was speaking, the culture was very different. Most people were familiar with the Bible. Most people accepted that the Bible was true. Most people believed that Jesus was God. But most people were only nominally Christian, having never made that final step of commitment. Jonathan Edwards' preaching was kind of a wake-up call to these people. Hey, look, all this head knowledge is getting you nowhere. You need to make a commitment or But that doesn't ring very true today. Our culture's changed. In our postmodern culture, I don't think that's very effective anymore. But Paul had a couple of things in this section that we need to bear in mind because they are powerful tools today. C.S. Lewis took what Jonathan Edwards said and he put it a little more gently. There were only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and to those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." One of our responsibilities as Christians is sharing the gospel. And that's not always very easy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine. He became a Christian only a little over a year ago. About 10 years back, his wife joined a Bible-believing church. She had a history of getting involved in fringy religious movements, and he was scared. He wasn't sure he was very happy about this at all. And he knew Shirley and I attended church, so he started asking me some questions. And this opened an opportunity to speak with this friend at length. And we had conversations. But frustratingly, all of those conversations went in circles. We would get to the end where I had made a point. He could either agree or disagree. And his usual response was to step back and say, "Yeah, I need more proof." At one point, he even told me that he had looked at Jesus, and Jesus seemed to him to be more of a comic book superhero than a real person. And he just really didn't get it. But then one day, he came to me. He was upset about something that someone had done, some horrible behavior. And he was talking about how immoral this was, how wrong this was. And I asked him, "Well, why is it wrong?" And he responded, "Well, it just is." So what you're telling me is that there's an absolute morality that comes from somewhere. Well, yeah. Well, let me ask you this question. Let's look at the universe for a moment. We know the universe burst into being out of nothing. If this was simply a cosmic accident and there is no God, then your life has no meaning. Your life has no purpose. You're a cosmic accident. Your protests that this is wrong, your encouragement for people to do what's right, those things don't mean a thing. Your morality is nothing more than a personal preference. And if morality is nothing more than a personal preference, then, my friend, deal with this issue. Look at the life of Mother Teresa, a nun who lived for her entire life in slums, some of the worst slums in the world in India, servicing the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized of people. Was that a good moral life? And he responded, "Well, yeah, of course." But if her morality was nothing more than a personal choice, then how was that any different from Adolf Hitler, who made a different set of personal choices? We can look at the universe and know there's something there. God's law is written on our heart. If God is there, He's spoken to us. And we can find Him just by opening our hearts and listening. My friend didn't really have an answer for that at that time. But a month later, he came back to me and said, I believe. I looked for God and found Jesus looking back. Paul closes this section of Romans on a very negative note. So with apologies to Tony, I'm going to color outside the lines and close by borrowing the first verse from next week's text for a bit. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There's no difference between Jew and Gentile. We're all lost. We're all unable to get to God on our own. We all need Jesus. And a lot of the rest of this book of Romans, Paul talks about what that means. But for this morning, I'd ask you to consider for a moment in your heart, have you been sitting on the fence? Have you been looking at the universe and saying, well, maybe yes and maybe no? Have you been wondering about the source of morality of God's law in your heart? And you kind of believe, you know about Jesus and he was a good teacher, but you've never taken that final step of committing to him, of bowing the knee and saying, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord, I'm yours and you are mine.